press recording. Thank you. Okay, so hi everyone, and welcome to the third and final session on quality improvement that Nick's kindly agreed to do for us across all the community services teams, which came about to support a gap that was identified during our ask of the training and development needs that people had. The first session was in January on improvement principles. The second session in March was on behavioural change, and today's third and final session is on culture and psychological safety. There'll be the opportunity for questions and answers at the end, and as you can see, I'm recording it for those who can't attend today. I'll add a link in the chat for where we're saving all the slides and recording. So now, thanks, Nick. Over to you.
Thanks, Vicky. Yeah, this one was supposed to be second in the series, but I was supposed to be called for jury service. That got stood down. But actually, reflecting on that, I think it's probably best in terms of the sequence. This one feels like it's better at the end. I was going through the slides, and it kind of does wrap up a lot of things we've been talking about up until this point, anyway. So, fortuitously, I think this falls quite nicely, and I've been rearranged for jury service next week, so I haven't got away with it. So I'm back on the bench tomorrow, next week. Sorry. So for those who we haven't met before, probably have through the course of the last couple of sessions, Nick Holding, head of improvement for the emergency care improvement support team, with the team for 7.5 years. About that now. Previously held a number of positions across the different kind of quality improvement, leadership development, quality management system kind of roles within predominantly the acute sector, but I've previous to the NHS, I also ran hotels. I was lead manager within the hospitality industry, and I spent a bit of time in engineering and manufacturing as well for a short time. So I always like to share with you a few book recommendations. You've probably got a list now of things that you've got on your either Audible queue or shelf of books to read. Unapologetically, this is going to be very heavily biased towards two people. That is Edgar Schein and Amy Edmondson. So for these three books, Edgar Schein for me is just the don for anything organisational culture, anything around to do with leadership, culture, and how that relates to organisations and individuals. And then from a psychological safety perspective, Amy Edmondson is, I'm a bit of a fanboy actually for Amy. Anything she writes, any article she writes is always so well thought through. And a couple of books there, The Fearless Organisation and Right Kind of Wrong, I would highly recommend. So this slides will be peppered in some cases overly overdosed with Schein and Edmondson, and I make no apology for that I've stolen all their work and represented it as my own today. So let's get started. Organisational culture. Interesting, this one, I think, is that it often comes up as a topic. We talk about it a lot. But when we try and think about, can we actually put our finger on what we actually mean by culture, it becomes increasingly difficult. I often think that this just exists all around us, but can we actually physically touch it? Is it something that we can put our fingers on and say that's culture and that's culture? And if we try and change culture, how do we do that if we can't physically see it or measure it or whatever? And I often find that there's failed attempts to do what is known as culture work, and ultimately this becomes a bit of a sticking plaster because we're going to focus on the culture. We're going to do some culture work, which I've never really known what that means. It often results in some quite tepid approach to bring people together in some kind of way and do some team building. But ultimately, for me, that, as this says, if you bake a bad cake, you can cover it with beautiful icing, but it's still a bad cake. You've done nothing to get really to the heart of what culture actually is, unless we truly understand how culture exists and what that means. First Schein quote of the day is that what he says is the only thing of really importance that leaders do is create and manage culture. That's one of our fundamental roles as leaders. If you do not manage culture, it manages you, and you may not even be aware of the extent that this is happening. And I think this is so true. The amount of organisations I go into where conversations around it's the culture or the culture of the organisation or the this is how we do things around here, and there's often a misperception of their own organisations and the extent to which the culture is actually affecting the performance process and well-being of the organisation. So it's such a strong driver, and as leaders, I don't think there's always the skill set out there necessarily that actually is able to understand how do you influence, manage, for want of a better word, that culture, and how do you establish the right conditions to allow culture to grow. So Shine as the Don for me of all things organizational culture. This is his definition of culture. I will break it down into simpler phraseology so I can understand it better than this. But this is highly intelligent man. A pattern of shared basic assumptions learned by a group as it solved its problems of external adaptation and internal integration, which has worked well enough to be considered valid and therefore to be taught to new members as the correct way to perceive, think, and feel in relation to these problems. So, although that's a really pretty wordy kind of statement, I took that verbatim from one of his books, and I took out the bits that I thought, okay, what does that really mean? And I think for me, it was about this shared basic assumption learned by a group, taken on board by a group of people, that is then to be taught to new members as a correct way to perceive, think, and feel. So that could be a positive thing, it could be a negative thing. Often when we talk in these terms, as I mentioned in the behavioural science session, we think about behaviour with negative connotations, and we'll load when we talk about culture. We often have these heuristics in our mind about what we mean by culture, but actually it could be a really positive culture, a really high performing culture, a really dynamic culture. And it's these kind of beliefs that we pass on to new members of the group as they come and join. But it's the assumptions that are learned over time by a group of people, whatever group of people that might be. It could be a group of people in a single team, it could be an organization, it could be a separate subsection of an organization. So it's whatever the group may be, and it is that thing that is passed on almost by osmosis, almost without even realizing it, as this is how we do things around here, for good or for bad. Another way of looking at culture, and of course, we always have to have an iceberg analogy in this because we always do. So it's one of those things. So there's the visible element and the invisible element, and the thing that those things that are visible, it is the things that are written, the strategy, from a culture. This is as an organisation, as a team, as a group of people. This is what we believe. These are our policies. These are our goals. These are our structures. These are our procedures. This is what we think. This is what we believe happens. And then the things that really get done are the things that we just habitually do. There's the traditional way of working, the norms that are established, the existing methods that have been established. And it's this idea of above the waterline is the workers imagined. It's the stuff that we write. It's the stuff that we create. And then the workers done are the things that are actually happening in reality. It's the translation of the workers imagined in terms of what then actually gets done. And that could be how people find their own way in that particular organization or that particular team. So there's always these two elements from a cultural perspective. I want to spend a bit of time on this because I felt this was important to try and get this across, that when we think about culture, how many different elements and layers there actually are within any given environment, whether that's a team or an organization. So taking from Shine's work, these levels of culture that exist, whether it's organizationally, nationally, internationally. So there's always a macro culture. This could be a country's culture. There is a UK culture. There's American culture. There's a French culture. There's an Indian culture. There's an African culture. There's a continental culture of Europe, Africa, Australasia, the Americas. There's a culture in a larger, wider scale. We can all recognise that in the experiences we have with people from different cultures and countries. It could be a national culture. There could be a culture of Wales, of England, of Scotland, of Northern Ireland, and as well. So there's a national culture as well. there's an organisational culture, that macro culture. You could say there's a culture in NHS England. Whatever you think about that right now, there is a culture of NHS England, and that will be similar and different to the culture of your local hospital trust, whoever that might be, or the local ambulance service, or whoever it might be. There'll be organisational, whole company, macro culture of that particular organisation. I'm privileged enough to go into many organisations, and there's a different culture in Sherwood Forest, for example, in Mansfield, as there is too. I was in Torbay last week. There's a different culture in there. Not bad, not good, just different. It just exists. There's a different kind of environment. But professional, really important for me when I learned this was this professional, the macro culture of the profession, and understanding that when you think about it, we've all got a perception of what we think of a nurse, of a doctor, of a paramedic, of a therapist, of a chief executive, of a finance director. In our mind's eye, we've all got an idea of what we think about from a cultural perspective. And we find this when we engage with people in different professional roles, that we think, oh, yeah, typical X or typical Y, and understanding the different perspectives of these people. So as a profession, we see groups of people who bring a particular culture and a particular way of working into the environment. So again, at organisational level, we can get down to if a company, a whole company has a whole trust had several sites, there'll be a particular culture within the individual sites. I can see that regularly. Looking at something like a mental health trust, for example, with multiple locations, they'll have a culture for each site. Community services are the same. Where I live in Shropshire, it's very rural, very dispersed. There is a very different cultural feel to the community hospital in Ludlow than there is in the community hospital in Oswestry or Whitchurch, and this is in the same organisation. So we're breaking it down into a subset of the same organisation, but a overarching different culture. And then within that, there'll be the various specialties and the various professions that exist within that culture. And then we talk about that subculture that sits at that level. It could be the team, the specialty. I'm not going to pick on anyone particular, but we all know there's certain specialty groups that have a certain culture about them. And sometimes it's a characteristic that you'd say a trait rather than what you'd pin a sort of culture, but it all makes up to the kind of culture, and then groups and departments. But then importantly, there is the smaller, really small groups, those non-established, nothing, you couldn't give a name to that group, but they're a clique. They're just a small tribe of people that exist together, maybe cross-departmental, maybe just meet for lunch. It used to be the smoking room or wherever it might be. It's the ones that stand outside, and there you go, someone's beat me to it. Christine, thank you very much. It used to be the smoking room. It's now the vaping space outside, or whatever it might be. There's the cyclists or whatever. Those people. There is these groups of other groups of people that have another sort of culture to them. So I always come across this question is, why do we think we can talk about culture as a one size fits all when you can see the degree of, if you just walked into a community hospital now, or you walked into an ED, you'd have different nationalities, you'd have different professions, you'd have different generational groups, you'd have possibly different organisations in there working different teams in that environment. So when we talk about doing culture work, how can we start to assume that we can just do something that's going to fit everybody's perspective? Because we're not taking the time really to understand how does culture actually exist amongst groups of people. And as we start to look at some of the details, some of the specifics around how culture presents itself, Shine produced this organisational culture model, which goes from quite shallow levels of culture to the more deeper levels that are more ingrained within organisations. These what he describes artifacts, values, and assumptions. We talked about artifacts. It's fascinating when you start to look for these things, and many of these things will probably be very very familiar to you. And then when you start noticing it, you start to see them even more. So these visible signs of an organisational culture, the things that are stuck up on the wall, the notice boards, the tidiness of the notice boards, the amount of out-of-date notices that are on the notice board, what's on the notice board, how many passive-aggressive signs exist in the kitchens, those kind of things. The dress codes, how do people present themselves? What's the job titles that people use? Is it authoritative? Is it is it status driven? What's the type of the environment that's created, and what's the design of the workspace? One that jumps out to me, and it still exists, and I couldn't believe it still exists, was the consultant's car parking space outside ED at a hospital that I went to. It's an artifact of an organisational culture that places one group above everybody else, that they have their own parking space still. It's for me, I thought that went out in the 70s and the 80s, but clearly not. It still exists. So while changing some of these artifacts will have some degree of influence, it won't have significant change, but it's a good starting point. I often I go through a little, sometimes I do this more intentionally, but sometimes I'll do it anyway, just a bit of a cultural walk through the organisation to look for the artifacts, what's happening down the corridors, what's the state of the decor, what's the bins looking like. I won't say which hospital it was, but I walked down a corridor not so long ago, and a member of staff kind of missed the bin with their sandwich wrapper, and it fell on the floor, and they carried on walking. And there's a cultural element to that. This was an organisation in the sort of tier one status of performance, so they were under significant scrutiny, so not particularly doing well. And you can see the culture is in that organisation for to a certain degree that was okay. That thing to just to walk past. Those espoused values we talk about, so the things that are above the waterline on the iceberg analogy. What does the organisation, what does the team, what does the structure say about itself? What's its values, its mission statements, those things that are written in the newsletters? What's the tones of those kind of things? What does it think about itself? Often I'm really very skeptical about these kind of things. We can all write mission statements and organisational values, and it bears no resemblance whatsoever to the actual organisation. But in itself, you're seeing the separation between workers imagined we would like to be a X organisation, but in reality, this is the reality on the ground. And again, those espoused values will provide a degree of change in the organisational culture, but it's slightly superficial in terms of giving a sense of direction and it reality. I suppose the one that jumps out for me on this one as an example of this would be if you started a new job and you attended induction, and the chief executive stood there at the start of the induction and said, "Oh, we really value our employees. We patient care is at the forefront of everything that we do. Quality trumps finance every time." These kind of espoused values, and then you start work, and then within a week you see the reality on the ground is that every conversation is about money. Are we really caring about? Is patient care really at the front of everything that we do? And am I treated like I am a really valuable asset of the organisation? You will soon get a sense of the difference between what is espoused and what is actually understood, and that for me is a greater measure of culture than surveys and team building exercises. And then the third one, the deeper level in Shine's model, which goes deeper into organisation, is those assumptions, the things that he talked about originally in that definition of culture, those underlying beliefs held by members of an organisation, and they are deeper indicators of an organisational culture. It is literally, how we work together, those behaviours. Are we successful? Are we not? Are we a failure of an organisation? Are we high performing, or are we just the victim in the system? What do people really think when they go to work? Because despite a lot of the pressures that exist at the moment, there are still plenty of organisations who believe, rightly so, that they are high performing in what they do, and teams. They have that inner belief. They have that inner culture of that organisation that we want to focus on the right thing, and we will do the right thing, and we are focused on quality, and we want to make sure that it's right, and we have that self-respect and that pride in what we do. And this becomes endemic both ways, in a sense of, meh, what can we do? It is what it is. We can't change anything. We'll just it, it isn't how I'd like it, but it just this is how we operate here. This is what we do. People don't tend to get on very well, but we just crack on. Or there's those others that really strive and want, and that's the deeper level. When it gets to this level, just in terms of how people think and exist and operate on a daily basis, then it's really endemic within that particular organization. And any sprinkling of glitter on the top is not going to affect that. This has to be felt and believed by the people who work every day in that kind of environment, whether it's a full organization or whether it's just a single team. You can create. I work in within ESIS. There are 6 sub teams within ESIS, and they all have a very different culture. Not going to say whether that's good or bad. It's just different, because there are different levels of underlying beliefs within each one. So we can exist within smaller groups as well. But this is the magic sauce. You get down to this level, the assumptions, the underlying beliefs of the people that exist in that space. And we're talking very heavily around kind of organizational culture, but this applies across communities, across sports teams. If you believe you're a winner, that improves the potential of actually being a winner. So look at some of these drivers of culture. What creates that? So we've looked at what are the indicators, what are the things that we can see that may describe a culture if you saw it. What are some of the drivers that influence that? And I think for me, a lot of it is around relationships, trust, confidence between people. As a organizational psychologist, I probably would say this, but it is around individuals. It's around human beings. I think a lot of the things we spoke about over these 3 sessions is around, we're just a bunch of human beings trying to get along and do some good stuff. But ultimately, we are we don't turn into different creatures when we go to work. We're still human beings in amongst it, and it's about how we think and how we make those decisions. And it's about how we exist between each other, those relationship levels that exist. And these 4 levels describe that. And again, based on some Shine's work, I think it was his son Peter Shine that developed this idea that we all exist at different levels. And from a work perspective, we often find ourselves in a level 1, transactional, professional. We'll pass the time of day. We know each other's name. We know each other's job title. We have a very transactional, professional relationship. In some cases, we can move that to level 2, where we may know a bit about their pets or their family or their interests or whatever, and we've developed a bit of a stronger relationship. And this is where we may share a few unwritten rules or unknown things that we would say, yeah, it's not really as good as we say it is. We're starting to get into a relationship with that person that we're able to trust each other and share some of the reality. And these are those underlying beliefs, and we start to exist in a place where we're not just operating professionally and transactionally, where we have to keep up the company line or the team line. We're actually able to move into a space. So that level 2 space is the sweet spot. We probably would never get. Sometimes we get into friendship, relationships, personal relationships through a work environment, but that's not something we would. That's something that happens as a result of just being in the same space. So it recognises that we can get to a level 3 kind of relationship in terms of intimacy, friendship, love, but it's not an ambition as we get into a work environment. That can create all other kinds of cultural complications. Between level 2 and level 1 is the sweet spot. What we want to get away from is that -1. And unfortunately, this still exists. We may look at this and think this is doesn't happen in this country, or doesn't happen. This is not the Victorian age anymore. Unfortunately, there is still cruel, abusive, inhumane relationships between individuals, bullying, harassment. sexual harassment, this that exists within organisations, unfortunately. And this is that -1 where somebody is made to feel less than the other person, and this one-up kind of element. And I'm probably speaking to a completely blank audience out here, saying most people in the room saying, "Who the hell is this?" Recognising my age now, and probably not relevant. But this is a very old sketch from what was called the Two Ronnies. It was a long time ago, and this is about how this one-up element. And if we create an environment which is, we want to put ourselves one up against somebody else, they will always feel one down in that relationship. So we're looking for acquiescence. We're looking. It was the weed that was. So we're looking for acquiescence between us. We're not looking to create and we can visualize this, can't we, in a certain culture where there are certain characteristics of people who want to put themselves above, who want to be one up, to almost create a sense of elevation. But knowing when we do that, the other person always feels a sense of one down. They are, and nobody likes that. So the one down person is going to try and get one up, and then the other person tries to get one up, and it's a constant battle between this, typically very much in the phraseology, that one-upmanship, trying to constantly battle to get status and position. Whereas if the culture is that we believe we should be talking to each other on the same level, developing that acquiescence in that relationship, then we're not looking to get one up or one down. And these are some of the drivers behind culture. When you find that there is a sense of trying to dominate the conversation, or dominate the delivery or the direction of travel, knowing that when you do that, there is always going to be a opposite effect to that. Biases also creep in. We have to recognize this as well, and biases exist, and unless we recognize our biases, then we're not familiar, we're not aware of where we find ourselves. And this is for me, it's a massive cultural driver, is that we don't understand some of the biases that exist, whether that's, lots written there, there's plenty of others. This idea of sort of confirmation bias, that belief in what we believe in, the authority bias. We talk about that one-up thing, the fact that just because somebody's in a position of authority doesn't mean to say they're always right. And that can be driven with a sense of, we don't question the levels of authority. Groupthink is a really strong one. I'm not going to rock the boat. I'm just going to go along with the crowd. And if anybody wants to, I'll just bear with me, because I'll put it in the in the chat. If everybody wants to look at the Ash experiment, and I write it there, it's a very old video, but look at the Ash experiment and look at groupthink, and look at how organisations can easily fall into that space where, even though when it's not the right thing to do, you'll still go along with the group through fear of rocking the boat. And we'll touch on psychological safety towards the end of this session. And then, just as we come towards the end of the sort of cultural element of this, the self-determination theory, one of the drivers of culture, first developed by Edward Deachy and Richard Ryan, and quite simply put, their theory talks about human beings have these three basic needs, and culture can be massively affected when one or all of these don't exist. So this idea of competence, autonomy, and relatedness. Do we feel like we have control? Do we know what we're doing? Do we understand our brief? Do we feel we have the skills and the competency to do it, both with a work environment and a home? This is a real strong driver for stress. People don't get stressed from being busy. They get stressed from feeling out of control of their environment, whether it's work or home. Autonomy, that belief that we have some control over our own destiny, that we can influence things. And relatedness, that connection to the team, the group, but also a belonging and a sense of, I understand the brief, I understand the work that I'm trying to do. The absence of any of these or all of these can have a significant influence on the culture of the organization. When you have lots of people with a sense of this of absence around this self-determination theory. And I touched, and it's a humble brag, but I'll still brag anyway. My organizational psychology master's dissertation was on what it is to be a nurse and trying to understand what's the role of a nurse in the modern NHS, and have they got those three levels of competency, relatedness, and autonomy in their work? And what kind of effect does that have on their well-being and sense of purpose and culture when they feel what they want to do is they want to be a nurse, they want to be working with patients, they want to look after patients, they want to go and fetch them a cup of tea, they want to go and sit down and have a chat and say, "How are you doing, Nick? How are you?" But if they spend all their day having to fill forms out and answer the phone and respond to people asking when the next bed's going to be come free, they have no autonomy. They feel less competent, and they have no relatedness to the work and why they went into being a nurse. And I only chose nursing because I had to narrow it down to one particular group. But you can apply the same to every professional group. There's a degree of moral injury in terms of when you go to work every day and can't be the person you want to be. What's those internal drivers? And I shared this with you in the last session. This in the end, what results in that is that you have high effort and low reward because you're not getting those intrinsic drivers. You're not getting that self-determination to say that, I really enjoy what I'm doing, because all of it has been removed. So culture, easy to talk about, less easy to focus on. And I share that just in terms of that pause when we think about culture, think about the complexity of it, and how there isn't that one size fits all, and how it exists all around us. But there are many things that we can do that can influence and change that. Moving on, relatedly again to culture, which is again one of the I didn't list it because I knew I was going to come on to it, was around psychological safety, and I wanted to tie these two. And I often tie these together in terms of presentations and sessions that I do because they're so interconnected. A lot of the times I've just done a session on psychological safety, and culture just becomes part of that because it is so intrinsically linked. So again, going back to Amy Edmondson's work, and I'm going to quote quite a well-known paper, the one at the bottom, that kind of led to a lot of this work. What was her definition of psychological safety? Well, namely, the belief that one will not be punished or humiliated for speaking up with ideas, questions, concerns, or mistakes, and the team is safe for interpersonal risk-taking. So it's always helpful in these sort of situations to try and connect this with something that is related to our own worlds. And I think about the team that I work in now. I think about teams that I've worked in previously, and hopefully you can do the same in terms of where you exist, and provide some kind of connection or anchoring to the comments that we're talking about now. And maybe the team that you're working in, maybe with the wider team, maybe a team that you've worked in previously. But trying to understand the psychological safety that may or may not exist. And I'll always try and find a reason to include this slide because I just think it's funny and it just makes me smile. But this thing that sits within us, the psychology of us as human beings, is that we are conditioned to avoid ridicule at an early age. Once we get into those teenage years, it is everything that we can do to avoid any kind of ridicule, or any kind of making a fool of yourself. And that becomes stronger and stronger. We get into the work environment, and we find ourselves in an environment where we feel like we're being judged, and we feel like we don't have that levels of confidence in what we do, because and we start to find ourselves that we avoid those risks, taking those risks, and avoid the chance of ridicule. Using some of Amy's words again, and we do work in this. We are a knowledge-based economy now. We're not in that kind of industrial age. People go to work, they stand on the production line, they're paid for their labour, their hours of work, and then they go home again. This is a knowledge economy, pretty much across the board now. We want our employees, we want our workforce to contribute. If again, that's an espoused value. Whether that's actually done or not is a whole different kettle of fish. But Amy talks about, for knowledge work to flourish, the workplace must be where people feel able to share knowledge. This means sharing concerns, questions, mistakes, and half-formed ideas. Being able to have that psychologically safe environment where we can just chew the fat, talk things over. Feel free to, I've got a random idea. What do you think? And recognise that it's only half-formed. It's a bit loose. It's not fully worked up. Let's just go with it for a bit. And a few lines from the paper itself, which I think are important to draw out. Engaging in learning behaviour, which is essentially improvement and change, is around learning behaviour. In a team, is highly dependent on team psychological safety. The implication of this result is that people's beliefs about how others will respond if they engage in behaviour, for which the outcome is uncertain, affects their willingness to take interpersonal risk. Interpersonal risk is a really important factor in this. Fast-paced work environments require learning behaviour. And then finally, the need to ask this, I think this is really important. The need to ask questions, seek help, and tolerate mistakes in the face of uncertainty while team members and other colleagues watch is probably more prevalent today than ever before. So this is the environment we find ourselves. If we were on our own, we would probably take a lot more risks and we'd probably try things out a lot more. We've all done that thing where, I don't know, whatever it is, we've tried something new at home. We'll probably try and I don't know, I started doing yoga a while ago. I thought I'm not going to go to a class and make a fool of myself. I'm going to do some at home first and just get to grips with it all before I start falling over and losing my balance. So I did it on my own because there was nobody else around to see me. I was happy to make a mistake on my own. So this idea of psychological safety is when you can do that kind of thing and make mistakes in a group of other people and they're watching. So again, recognizing where you may or may not have come from in your own personal careers. The environment may be psychologically dangerous. There's a fear of admitting mistakes. There's a blaming of others. Less likely to share different views. Don't rock the boat. This is how we do things around here. And that common knowledge effect, that groupthink, the Ash experiments that were mentioned before. This idea that, well, yeah, this is just what happens down here. Or is it psychologically safe? Are we happy and comfortable admitting where we've made a mistake and recognizing that we can go back and learn from that failure, sharing ideas openly, being open to the idea of some mild Mickey taking, the fact that all that kind of stuff that builds a strong relationship that we know we probably have with our friends, those really great friends that we all recognize and we have, that we know we can say anything to, we can give each other like good ribbing occasionally. They're not going to take offense. But that all leads to better innovation and decision making. I think one of the I wouldn't recommend this, and just for the recording, I'm not recommending this. But a colleague of mine who used to work in a management consultancy, they used to have what was called drunk tanks. So they used to have a few drinks, bottle of wine maybe, go and sit in a room and thrash out all these wonderful random ideas, because all our inhibitions slightly go out the window a little bit when we've had a few. And the environment when we can just say what we want without those inhibitions, again, ethically, I'm not sure where we sit on that one, but I think, you know what, there's something about that idea of how we release ourselves from the inhibitions that we sometimes have and where that goes to. And this speaks to that sense of psychological safety alongside motivation and accountability. The bottom axis is often seen quite negatively. We're going to hold you to account. We're going to motivate you. But without high psychological safety, you will get into high accountability, high motivation, puts people in the anxiety zone. It means just being held to account. But high accountability, when you understand what's expected of you, you can share those ideas, you can push back a little bit. High psychological safety, then you're in a genuine learning zone. You're free to think, you're free to share ideas, you're free to express your opinion. The other ones to the more left-hand side, then you've got apathy, you've got comfort. But Amy Edmondson talks about this real sweet spot of when we're talking about improvement and change, if we find ourselves in that learning zone where there's high motivation, high accountability, and also high levels of psychological safety, you find yourself in a place where there is high levels of improvement, learning, development, ongoing change, which exists within that space. There's a bit of learning as well, more from the paper which I drew out from the Right Kind of Wrong book. This is taken directly from that book specifically. Amy Edmondson talked more about the intelligent failures. These are things that are intentionally done, which may or may not result in a failure, but it's intentional. When we get failure which isn't intentional, which something that is, it was never intended to be a test or a trial, then it happened by accident. Then we find ourselves, well, that failure is not something we want to aspire to. But intelligent failure, where we know we're going to try something and it could fail, then at least we're ready for it. And this is the basis of that psychologically safe environment, when you know you can intelligently fail. The study that a lot of the study that led to the original paper was around hospital errors, medication errors, activities in theatres. Spent a lot of time in hospitals in America, and wanted to ask the question: was there a correlation between error rates and team effectiveness in hospitals? And what it showed was that it was statistically significant, but not expected in the expected direction. And I'll touch on that in a minute. The additional question was added to the original research that asked, if you make a mistake in this unit, ward, department, whatever, it won't be held against you. And this was a key element of the research that was added, the realization that this was missing as part of the research. And the real eureka moment that Amy Edmondson and the team established was that better teams probably don't make more mistakes, but they're more able to discuss those mistakes. And the assumption that I was reading this originally, I was thinking, yeah, what will happen is that there's high levels of accountability and motivation, psychological safety, and they'll have ironed out all their mistakes because they'll have just worked it through, and they won't make as many mistakes because they'll feel able to correct it beforehand. And that assumption was really easy for me to make, but the reality is that the mistakes don't change. And I reference it. I worked for a while with an organization called Virginia Mason in Seattle, in America, high performing hospital in Washington State, in the north west of America. And they showed me a graph when I first started connecting with them that showed their incident reports. Those have used ATEX before, or whatever system we use, but they're essentially their patient safety incident reports. And it showed me this graph that saw it going up and up, and all of a sudden, at one point, it just skyrocketed through the roof. I was like, why are they showing me this? They're supposed to be telling me how wonderful they are. And this graph was showing this steady increase in incident reports and then massively going through the roof. And then they explained to me that this is one of their drivers. They want to see more errors being reported because that demonstrates a level of psychological safety that somebody feels able to report that incident. And genuinely, this was down to, they were reporting things like a sandwich that was delivered to the ward that was out of date. For them, that was reported because people didn't feel they were going to get their backside kicked because they'd sent the wrong sandwich, but it was more about how do we learn and avoid that happening in the future. And this quote here, this example here from the book, this one nurse explained about the severity of a drug error, or the need to report it because of the toxicity of the drug. And then in contrast, another nurse said, well, no, we wouldn't report it because we'll get blamed and we'll put on trial. That idea of I'm going to Datex you or whatever it might be. So it wasn't the fact of actually reporting more mistakes. It was the fact that they're able to discuss them more and bring them out into the open. And as we know, with any problem, you bring it to the surface and then at least you're able to deal with it. And then from a performance perspective, one of my colleagues, Chris Green, who's a great analyst in our team, we looked into this to look at, is there any correlation between the staff survey and emergency care performance? We're focused on emergency care, so I wanted to have a look at this. And what we found is that on the bottom axis there, you've got 4-hour performance for organisations up to 4-hour. We were working to 95% for our performance. On the left-hand side, you've got the percentage of people that stated, agreed or strongly agreed that I am trusted to do my job. And there's that direct correlation between the number of people that agreed that I'm trusted to do my job and the performance in ED. You can see that really clearly in the graph. Second one here, we work well as a team. Same measure on the left in terms of working well as a team, organizational performance on the bottom axis. Same again with the freedom to act, freedom to improve your own work, higher levels of the ability to do that, higher performance. And in contrast to that, do I feel frustrated at work? high levels of frustration, lower performance. So when we talk about, if anybody's got all this psychological safety crap, it's all a bit fluffy, isn't it? All a bit nice. We haven't got time for that. We've got stuff to do. Psychological safety leads to higher performance if we want to treat it as a performance metric. And it's great because we can actually measure this, and it's something that that has been done recently. These questions are measurable in terms of psychological safety. Take these away, think about it. Do a bit in your own team. I think we did it originally when I first come to see you shared some of these with you, and I've done it again. Amy Edmondson's foundation did a global survey last year, over 11,000 responses, and this was some of the results of that survey that drew out some interesting findings. That tenure in job increases psychological safety. 10 years plus was the safest. So how do we intentionally support new starters, new people? If we now know that psychological safety grows over time, what can we do to help people who haven't been in the team for longer? No statistical significance effect between introverts and extroverts. So I'm an introvert, really low on the extroversion scale. I would assume that those extroverts they're always psychological safe because look how bloody confident they are. But actually, there's no correlation whatsoever between introverts and extroverts. So we're all broadly the same. Personality types may describe how we engage in terms of that extroversion or introversion, but it doesn't change the feelings of safety to engage. Somebody who's extroverted may appear to be more engaging and wanting to get involved, but underlying that is a sense of could be a lack of psychological safety. Men more likely to feel psychological safe. I'm sure you'll all have a view on that. I thought about that. Yeah, there's some gender stereotypes potentially at play, but men generally feel more psychological safe in an environment. So the research I dug into this a bit. This tended to touch more on these feelings of needing to prove ourselves. Maybe there's a male psyche that doesn't need to prove itself as much as the female psyche. I'm not going to make a judgment call on that. The research suggested that this is based on the feelings of needing to prove ourselves between the genders. No significant difference between generational groups. So whether you're Gen Z, Millennial, Gen X, Boomer, psychological safety doesn't change. It doesn't change because you're older and wiser. I'm older. I'm not sure I'm wiser, but I'm one of those Gen Xers. I'm not. It isn't higher because you're young, supposedly confident. That doesn't change. And unsurprisingly, those in leadership positions report high levels of psychological safety. So we know that leadership brings its own risks in terms of exposure to organisational pressures and culture, but how the feelings of speaking up is higher in this group. So I've left the link on the bottom of the slide, so when you have it, you'll be able to click on and see the full survey on that one. And I think the leadership questions is always an interesting one, and how that relates to psychological safety and leaders' role within psychological safety. I've shared David Marquet's books before, Turn the Ship Around, Leadership is Language, those books that I think I probably shared in the first session. People are afraid to speak truth to power, and we see it all the time. Steep power gradients inhibit information flow. When we flatten the power gradient, we create a culture where it's safe for everyone to share ideas, ask questions, and voice concerns. So where sometimes we create an intentional hierarchy, this goes back to that one up, one down environment, we lose the ability to share information upwards. And we have to just face the fact that hierarchy can naturally create fear within teams. So it is the hierarchy's responsibility to create the environment where some of that is mitigated. I'm not going to talk through all these. You can have a look at it in your own time. But that essence, the lower the status in the hierarchy, the high levels of stress that is experienced in the presence of those with a higher status, and the less likely that person's going to speak up and raise their concern, unless that's an intentional environment that's created, unless that is explicitly said and followed up. And when they do speak up, they aren't then criticised or to have their legs taken from underneath them. When I started this job 7 and a bit years ago, I met with my then line manager, who appointed me, and we had dinner the year before. A few of us were having dinner, and she said, "Oh, it's our team meeting tomorrow. So you're going to come on to see meeting, you'll meet everybody. I want you to bring your opinion. I want you to speak up. I want you to sort of challenge us if you think you're a fresh pair of eyes in the group. And so, I did. And it was like tumbleweed bundled across the meeting room as I challenged a perspective. I thought, well, that didn't go well, did it? Clearly the difference between the hierarchy saying that, speak up, you can challenge. The reality on the ground was that wasn't going to happen. So we have a role. We have a role as leaders to reduce that fear. And by every measure, fear is not a good motivator. And unfortunately, there is still those believers that will just tell them what to do, and we'll use our positions of authority, and we'll bully people into doing what we want them to do. It just doesn't work, and unfortunately, it does still exist. But fear is just not a good motivator of people. In fact, actually, biologically, physiologically, neurologically, that's easy for me to say. We restrict thinking. We close down when we're in a fearful environment. It reduces blood flow to non-essential organs. We just close down. We can all feel it when we're in a stressed environment. So really important that that is taken out of the system. And when we find ourselves in the most serious situations, if we aren't able to speak up and we aren't able to share what we think is an issue, we often will focus on the most serious incidences or outcomes, but all the things that sit below that. This is the out-of-date sandwich that I talk about. Heinrich's safety triangle talks about all those things that happen at a very low, bubbling up. Any of those unsafe acts, behaviours, or conditions could become one of the one serious injury, death, whatever it might be. There is at one point that one was one of the 3,000, and if we're not able to capture some of those, there's a potential for any of those to escalate to become the one. So as I bring this bit to a close, and there are a few minutes for questions, this idea that if we don't try something new, we'll never make it. We'll never make mistakes, but we'll never get anywhere. We'll just exist, and we'll just stay where we are. Amy Edmondson captured this phrase that I took out of a teaming book, another book for you, Teaming. Do we when we're trying to introduce change or new things into an environment, do we organise to learn in the planning phase, or do we organise to execute? Have we got a meticulous action plan that is to the nth degree mapped out, that we're just focused on the execution, or do we accept that in this planning phase there'll be some learning as well? And then when we're in the execution phase, do we execute, introduce, implement, whatever word you want to use, with an open mind learning mindset that has that freedom to learn and experiment and try things out? Or do we execute for efficiency? We have to do this as quickly as possible in the shortest time scale with a few resources as possible. And you can tell which one you think is going to bring the best benefit. So the environment we find ourselves in is, the two difference between it's always sit, stay, heal, never think, innovate, be yourself. And what we're trying to do is create that environment with psychological safety and culture where the feelings of freedom to act, to innovate, to be yourself is prevalent. And finally, as Richard Branson often talks about, if you look after your staff, they look after your customers, patients, family members, carers, whatever it might be. It is simple as that. So our starting point being the people, the staff. And I think hopefully you'll have picked up through the themes of the 3 sessions that's where my focus has shifted to in recent years, and that's where I think a lot of the starting point can make a difference. We focus on our people; they're the ones that are going to make the difference for us. Thank you for that. Lots of content, I know. I appreciate that. Hopefully that's been useful. Again, thank you for listening. A couple of minutes for any questions. If not, put them in the chat and I'll pick them up afterwards. Vicky, hope that was okay.
Thank you, Nick. Brilliant. Really informative as ever. And I'm really excited that we've got the recording and we'll be able to share the slides and recording later so we can rewatch that over again. Thank you. Really appreciate you giving us your time. Does anyone have any questions? Not directly, they can go in the chat and Nick will come back to it later.
Often conscious of time. There's lots of content to get through, and It is. I think you're right. Definitely, I'll share the slides. Go back if you want to sort of pick up any elements of the presentation again, just to listen or just to watch some of the slides again. I think it's important that bit in trying to absorb a lot of information on a topic that is really quite complex. And I don't say that because I've just taken lots of other people's work and represented it in a way that which to you guys today. It's the complexity of trying to get to the bottom of it, and it takes time, and it's not a quick fix. And this idea that we can do some cultural work and we'll create as if I can empower people is an arrogant statement that I will create some psychologically safe environment. So, Christine.
I suppose the thought occurred to me was, have you ever done any work with turning around a culture? And does that always kind of start with individual teams rather than the organization per se?
Yeah, it's often there is a buy-in at a very senior level, and the organisation that I worked at, the last proper job that I did, there was an organisational buy-in to the idea of this approach, but then you just went very low into the organisational and worked with teams, and you change a culture incrementally. Then it does start to get a little. It can be quite. It can be quite contagious, I suppose would be the word I'd use. It can spread between people, but you can't influence culture at a very high level, and it takes years. I've seen it happen. A change of chief executive can change the culture, but it takes years, just the way they do things. It's not something you just have to believe that this is a long-term piece of work. The Virginia Mason organisation that I talked about probably took them about 15 years to genuinely change the organisational culture.
Thank you.
I'll just put a question in the chat, and Pedro also says, can you have a session with the government, please? But Amanda says, thank you, Nick. What is the highest level you've presented us to?
Executive level in an organisation. And again, that's getting that buy-in that there is a requirement to do things differently in the first instance, and recognising that what we've done previously may not. And I always try to be respectful to say that people have got where they are based on a certain set of beliefs, based on a recruitment process that has reinforced those beliefs. So why wouldn't we continue to do it? When we ask people in interview, what have you done? Tell me all the things that you've succeeded at. We're driving people to a more individual, I've done that. It reinforces the belief that as a it's all about my decisions and I get stuff done, and that's what we want. And there's an environment where we get stuff done. So I can never really blame people if I'm stood in front of senior leaders. And I was literally last week I could see this playing out with a senior leader in an organisation that clearly that's what they've been expected to do. There's been a change in leadership. They expected a slightly different style, but this person had been conditioned to operate in that. They've been in the organisation for years, and then so he was only doing what he was probably expected to do and learned those behaviours. Going back to Shine's quote there about those learned behaviours. So we have to allow people to metaphorically give them a nice kind ladder that they can step down off that particular perch, and do that in a sensitive way. So I can only really present at a high level to get their buy-in, to get them, there's an approach to this, and recognising what our role as senior leaders are in that.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Nick. We're at time, so
Yep.
I'm going to draw it to a close. Anyone who's got any more questions, please do put them in the chat for Nick. And thanks again. I really appreciate you doing this, Nick.
Absolute pleasure. Good to see you all again. We'll catch up soon.
Thank you.
Bye.